Welcome to True Real Studio, where we bring you some of the best stories from around the internet. If this is something you're interested in, please like, subscribe, and click the notifications so you don't miss a video. You can find all the original creators' links in the description. Today we dive into 6 gripping true crime stories that will leave you speechless. Our first story takes us to Ohio, where the promising life of Reagan Tokes, a bright Ohio State University student, was tragically cut short just months before her graduation. This heart-wrenching case shared by @TieKnots not only led to a desperate investigation, but also inspired the Reagan Tokes Act to enhance public safety. Join us as we explore the chilling details of her story.
May 7th, 2017 was the big day. The Ohio State University graduation ceremony was in full swing, but when the name Reagan Tokes was called out, Reagan wasn't there, and a small group of people walked up to accept her degree in tears. The group was Reagan's family. They were on their way to accept her degree on her behalf, as she wasn't there to accept it herself. But that's because Reagan had been found brutally murdered in a park just a few months before that big day. She'd been looking forward to graduation, but now instead of beaming up at her parents from the stage in her graduation gown, waving at the camera, and shaking hands with the alumni, Reagan was buried in the ground, and her family was left with nothing. Nothing but unimaginable pain. Welcome to True Crime Stories. I'm your host, TieKnots, and if you love old-fashioned true crime without a bunch of AI garbage, you've come to the right place, because that's basically all we do here. True crime and no drama. So if that's your thing, be sure to subscribe. It's totally free and just keeps you up to date with all my future cases. Reagan Delaney Tokes was born on March 13th, 1995 in Edgewood, Kentucky. She attended Anthony Wayne High School, where she participated in lacrosse and tennis. Reagan was raised as a Christian, and she was defined as a vibrant, energetic, athletic, and very caring young girl. She was also smart as a whip. She graduated from high school with honors and went on to enroll in Ohio State University to study psychology. When she got into college, the Tokes family moved to Parkland, Florida, where her parents both got jobs. But Reagan decided to stay behind to finish up her degree at Ohio State, which is actually her dream university. Her mom defined Reagan as a ball of energy, but she was incredibly warm, and like many of us, had a particularly soft spot for animals. Well, at the time of today's case, Reagan was a senior, getting ready for graduation. In fact, she already had her first major job lined up, and she was just a few short months away from starting her life as an adult. At the time, Reagan was living in an off-campus housing with 4 different roommates. It was near campus, so she easily went to and from her classes to her home in no time. She was also working part-time at a local restaurant to pay her tuition. But unfortunately, not everything was a cakewalk for Reagan. Even though everything else in her life was bright and promising, the same couldn't be said about her personal life. See, Reagan had been in a relationship with a guy named Jacob, better known as Jake, and the two had known each other for a very long time, several years. To everyone else on the outside, Reagan and Jake were meant to be. They were each other's best friends. But since both of them were in their senior year, they decided to prioritize their studies, and in the end, they called it quits. But it was easier said than done. And even though Reagan tried to keep herself busy, it was evident to her friends, family, and even roommates that the breakup was anything but easy on her. Reagan tried not to let her emotions get the best of her, so she kept herself busy and even talked to Jake often, but only as friends. This was an incredibly difficult time for her, but she refused to let her emotions show, at least as much as she could. She had a lot to look forward to, but her life was very different now without Jacob. But either way, she buckled down, pulled herself together, and marched towards her inevitable graduation ceremony. Reagan was just 2 months away from getting her diploma. But until then, she had to keep up the grind, going to work every day, studying after class, getting ready for finals, all the typical stuff. But this brings us all the way to February of 2017, when Reagan put on her daily uniform and headed off to work on a chilly afternoon. But the only problem was, this particular day would be unlike any other that Reagan had ever seen. Because after her shift at work, Reagan never came home. Reagan worked at Bodega, a bar and restaurant in downtown Columbus. Her shift started early in the evening, so on February 8th, 2017, just months away from graduation, she got ready and left her apartment. As she got done with her shift, she left the restaurant and drove home in her 1999 silver Acura. This was around 9:45 p.m. Now, even though Reagan was pretty familiar with the place, her parents still worried for her, because they were literally 1,000 miles away from each other. So to put her parents at ease, Reagan kept them updated via texts. But on this fateful day, Reagan's family didn't receive any texts or calls from her. Now this was really odd, because up until an hour or two ago, Reagan was actively texting her dad, updating him on miscellaneous things in her life. Reagan's sister and dad blew up her phone, but she would never pick up again. Up until the next day, no one heard a peep from Reagan, and this was when panic settled in, and they decided to reach out to Reagan's roommates. But imagine their surprise when the rest of the girls hadn't heard from Reagan either. On top of that, Reagan wasn't even at home. Her bedroom was empty, and her bag was still there, so she didn't go to class. Again, this was incredibly unusual. Their final stop was the restaurant where Reagan worked, Bodega. And there, the manager confirmed Reagan was present at her shift, and she left without any problem. With all that done, the girls updated Reagan's parents on the situation. And this is what ultimately led to 21-year-old Reagan Tokes being reported missing. Reagan's roommates began to spread the word about her disappearance on social media. Everyone was on edge and worried for Reagan. Where could she have gone? And most importantly, what had happened? Well, it was a day after Reagan's disappearance that 911 received a very distressed call. The call was made from a man working in Scioto Grove Metro Park. His stroll was about to take a traumatizing turn, though. As he reached a vast field in the park, in the distance, he saw something. It's become kind of a running theme at this point, but naturally at first, the guy thought that maybe he was seeing a mannequin. But say it with me, it's never a mannequin. As soon as the man realized what he was looking at, he called 911 and begged them to come to the scene of an apparent crime. The detectives almost immediately arrived at the scene, and sure enough, it was the disrobed body of a deceased woman with 2 wounds to the head. She'd been attacked with a firearm at point-blank range, and she was cold to the touch. The police had a very bad feeling about this. They knew that 21-year-old Reagan was just reported missing, and now they'd found the body of a woman. But to be sure, they needed to ID this body as soon as possible. Well, that didn't take long because the woman was wearing a very unique necklace, and she also had a tattoo of a circle on her body. The detectives called in one of Reagan's relatives, her uncle, because he lived nearby, and he was unfortunately the one to identify her body. It was such a heartbreaking and devastating moment for Reagan's uncle because he took one look at the body and knew without a doubt this was his niece. But the worst part was the police still needed to call her parents and break the news. This was not the update anyone had been hoping for, but unfortunately it was reality. Reagan Tokes was gone. Reagan's disappearance was now a full-blown murder investigation, and the detectives had various theories. It could have been a random attack. It could have been someone who knew Reagan and wanted her dead. Or it could be the doing of a serial killer. There were multiple theories in the opening stages of this investigation. All of this would be ironed out soon enough, but in the meantime, an autopsy was carried out, and the findings were harrowing. Not only was Reagan's life taken in an execution-style manner, but the murderer had also taken advantage of her beforehand. This news in particular was one of the hardest things for Reagan's family to come to terms with. It was bad enough to hear that their daughter had her life stolen away from her, but like this was too much. Initially, the police had very little evidence, but they were trying to find clues to connect Reagan's attack to several different robberies and attacks in the Columbus area at the time. There were multiple reports of people getting overpowered and attacked from behind, and the assailants would then rob the victims. This happened in a lot of dimly lit areas and streets in the city, and it didn't come as a surprise that the street behind Bodega, where Reagan and the rest of the part-time workers parked their cars, was very dark and dangerous. While the investigators were looking into this, they also decided to question people closest to Reagan. One of those people was none other than Reagan's ex-boyfriend, Jake. The detectives were suspicious of Jake because he and Reagan had just broken up, and Reagan was pretty upset and depressed about it, so naturally, Jake immediately became a person of interest. So he was called into the station, and after he was grilled with question after question, well, he had a rock-solid alibi for the night that Reagan went missing, and he was also very worried for her. Even Reagan's roommates came to defend Jake, saying that there was no way he could have done something like this. I mean, sure, the breakup was hard, but it was hard for both of them. And now Jake was crestfallen at the bright, bubbly, and beautiful woman that he fell in love with and shared so much time with, and are now being gone. Well, sometime later, the investigators let Jake go because they couldn't find anything fishy about the guy or his behavior. So they were back to square one. What's interesting is that at this point, Reagan's car was still missing, and the police still needed to find it. They thought that there'd be some kind of evidence in it that could help the investigators solve this case, which was causing unrest among the people in the community. So the investigators doubled down and used license plate tracking to figure out where Reagan's car would be. And sure enough, their efforts came through. Reagan's car was found. It was abandoned on the side of a road on a street not too far from where Reagan's body was found on Oakwood Avenue in southeast Columbus. This was huge progress in the case because once the detectives looked inside the car, there were a lot of things that really piqued their interest. First, it looked like someone tried to set the car ablaze, but obviously, unfortunately, it didn't work. There were cigarette butts on the front seats of the car, as well as a red gas can inside the car. But speaking of inside, the car was a mess. There were receipts littered all over the car seats, but this was nothing but a clearly labeled trail of evidence for the police. This was incredible news both for the cops and Reagan's family, because there was a good chance these receipts would lead them straight to her killer. So the investigators took all of these things and sent the cigarette butts and car for DNA testing, while they honed in on the receipts in the meantime. But these weren't just store receipts, though. They were bank receipts, ATM transaction receipts to be exact. And when the police went through this handful of receipts, it seemed as though someone tried to use Reagan's ATM card to withdraw money, and a lot of it. It seemed that the person tried to withdraw hundreds of dollars, but obviously it didn't work. In the end, the person only managed to withdraw 60, so the investigators finally had a lead. They just needed to go to the same ATM from which these transactions were made, and they would get their answers, either via CCTV, fingerprints, or a plethora of other methods. So to the bank, the detectives went. And when they checked the CCTV footage, they were shocked. They were expecting a robber making a transaction with Reagan's cards. But when they viewed the footage, it was Reagan who was making the transaction. She was in her car, and even though the footage wasn't clear enough to make everything out, there was no doubt that Reagan wasn't alone. Someone was in the passenger side of the car, and from the looks of it, they were forcing Reagan to withdraw a lot of money from the bank. While the investigators were trying their best to enhance the footage to see who it was that got into her car, they got yet another hit, and it was even more promising. The DNA on the cigarette butts found in Reagan's car had just been matched. They were able to track down one particular man, and he already had a laundry list of felonies. This was 29-year-old Brian Goldsby. He wasn't your typical criminal, though. He'd actually been released from prison just a couple months before Reagan's abduction and murder in November of 2016. And he was listed as a Tier 3 sex offender. Let that sink in. Brian had been living a life of crime since he was a child, but as an adolescent, he took advantage of two kids aged just 5 and 6. This is a crime that I don't even have words for, and I don't think anyone does. Taking advantage of someone is a new level of evil in its own right. But 5 and 6-year-old kids? Well, Brian committed many crimes, including criminal trespassing, receiving stolen property, theft, shoplifting, criminal damage, the list goes on and on. He was eventually charged with threatening his own mom, even. From then on, it was crime after crime, and as he got older, his crimes only got darker and more perverse. Brian was eventually sentenced to 6 years in prison for abducting and forcing himself on a pregnant woman, all in front of her 2-year-old son. But he was released somehow in early November of 2016. But Brian was anything but a model prisoner behind bars. During his very short time in prison, he was a menace, committing over 52 infractions, including possessing contraband, refusing to obey orders, stealing, fighting, and creating disturbances. He had to be sent to 5 different prisons throughout 5.5 years, but somehow he was still allowed to be released after all this. Following his release, Brian was given a GPS tracking device by a re-entry program for ex-offenders called Alvis. But it was as good as useless because Alvis didn't even bother to monitor Brian at all. His own parole officer didn't even keep up with him. He committed 6 more robberies while he was on parole and never even got reprimanded for it. Well, after his release from prison, Brian was living in a temporary housing center, which was run by the Exit program. But again, they failed to
What a heartbreaking tale of a life full of promise ending so tragically. It's a reminder of how laws can be shaped by the most devastating events. Moving on to our next story, we delve into the tragic Eastburn family murders. This horrific crime against a military family led to the wrongful conviction and eventual exoneration of Timothy Hennis. Thanks to @Explorer with us for bringing us the story that highlights the complexities and pitfalls of the justice system.
This next case is no less dramatic than the Goose Green stabbing, but has even more dire consequences. Living in Fayetteville, North Carolina in 1985, the Eastburns were a military family. Captain Gary Eastburn was part of the Air Force and had moved his family to Pope Air Force Base so that he could work as the chief of air traffic control. Gary's wife, Katie, was more than happy to move where her husband needed to go, and happily brought along the couple's 3 children, 5-year-old Kara, 3-year-old Aaron, and 22-month-old Jana. In May 1985, the family decided they needed a change, and that they would relocate to England so that Gary could work as a liaison with the Royal Air Force. Gary was away in Montgomery, Alabama for training at a squadron's officer school during much of the packing and planning for the move, and so Katie took over most of the responsibilities. She realized that the family wouldn't be able to take their English setter Dixie with them for the trip, so she posted an ad in the local paper for someone to come take Dixie. On May 7th, 27-year-old Army Sergeant Timothy Hennis called about the ad and came to visit the Eastburn house to see Dixie. Timothy said that he and his wife owned a Spitz and that with their newborn daughter, it was the perfect time to add another dog to his family. And so he took Dixie with him. On May 11th, Gary became concerned when Katie didn't answer any of his calls, but concluded that she must have been busy with the move and their kids. However, the Eastburns' neighbor was also worried and soon called the police when he hadn't seen the family in a while. Police found Katie's body inside the house next to the bed, along with those of her 2 oldest children. "Death has a smell, its own aroma. I'll never forget the smell in there," one detective later said. Katie had been assaulted, stabbed 15 times, and her throat cut, while Kara was also stabbed and Aaron bludgeoned in the chest and back. Jana was left unscathed by the attacker, but was severely dehydrated by the time she was found. It was determined that Katie and her daughters had been killed the night of May 9th and early morning of May 10th. Investigators found evidence of both fingerprints and hair, and this, along with a luminol test, revealed that the killer had poorly attempted to clean the crime scene. Devastated by the loss, Gary returned to his home in an effort to aid investigators. He determined that cash and Katie's ATM card had been stolen, along with a slip of paper where she had written her PIN number. Witnesses came forward to say that they had seen someone enter the Eastburn house the night Katie and her daughters were killed. The person was described as being a tall white man, wearing a knit cap and a black jacket that had "Members Only" written on the back. He was seen driving from the house in a white Chevrolet. Katie's bank card was also used after her death to withdraw cash, and witnesses saw a man who matched the same description in the area where the money was taken out. Timothy Hennis was quickly identified as the prime suspect in the murder, as he fit witness descriptions, and one witness even picked him out of a lineup. Timothy said he had no contact with Katie beyond picking up the dog, and claimed that he was at his in-laws the night of the murder, except for a short period when he stopped to refuel his car while returning home. Despite this, he was interviewed and asked to give saliva, hair, and fingerprint samples. Timothy's alibi fell apart when his former girlfriend came forward and said that he had visited her house that night. and evidence was found that he brought his members-only jacket to the dry cleaners on May 10th. He was also seen burning things in a bin by his neighbors. Timothy was arrested and charged with all 3 deaths. During his trial, Timothy was offered a plea deal, which he turned down. He was then found guilty on 3 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. While waiting on death row, Timothy received an unsigned letter saying, "Dear Mr. Hennis, I did the crime. I murdered the Eastburns. Sorry you're doing the time. I'll be safely out of North Carolina when you read this." The same letter was also sent to the local sheriff's office. Based on the new evidence, Timothy appealed his sentence, which he was granted in 1988, marking the first time someone on death row in North Carolina had been granted a retrial. Timothy's lawyers argued that because police used graphic photos of the crime scene as part of his interrogation, the images had undue influence on him and swayed anything he said while being questioned. The new trial tore into the witnesses who claimed to have seen Timothy on the night of the murders. For one witness, his testimony was brought into question because he had described the weather as fair that night, when in fact it had been overcast. As well, another witness was challenged as she had originally said she didn't see Timothy near the bank when Katie's card was used, but altered her statement right before the trial. The only evidence seen to prove Timothy's guilt was his members-only jacket, but the defense proved that it had been tested and no traces of blood were ever found. In a shocking twist, Timothy went from waiting to be executed for the horrific crimes to being found not guilty of any of the charges. After the trial, Gary Eastburn took his only surviving daughter to England with him, where he eventually remarried. After his not guilty verdict, Timothy Hennis ended up re-enlisting in the Army and even was promoted to staff sergeant. He served in both Iraq and Somalia and was even part of Operation Desert Storm. When he retired from the Army, Timothy was a master sergeant. But the twists of this case do not end here. In 2005, Captain Larry Trotter was at a detective seminar which used the Eastburn murders as a case study to discuss the importance of credible evidence as it was still unsolved. While there, Trotter learned that DNA had been collected from a semen sample at the crime scene, but never tested because DNA technology was unreliable in the late 80s. Trotter decided to have the DNA tested, and in 2006, it was shockingly determined that it was undoubtedly from Timothy Hennis. Though Trotter appeared to have finally solved a decades-old case, there was one glaring problem: double jeopardy. The Fifth Amendment's double jeopardy clause states that because Timothy had been acquitted of the murders, he could not be retried for the same crime. It appeared that Timothy was going to get away with a triple homicide, and there was nothing the police could do about it. However, in the next twist of this case, the Army decided to take things into their own hands. In September of 2006, Timothy was recalled back into military duty and moved to Fort Bragg. There he was court-martialed, as the Uniform Code of Military Justice allows for members of the military who have previously been tried in civilian court to still be court-martialed. It was the only way around the clause of double jeopardy to have Timothy tried for his crimes. Timothy attempted to appeal, as he believed that the Army didn't have the jurisdiction, but was denied. In fact, he attempted to appeal on 2 other occasions. At his court-martial trial in 2010, the DNA evidence was finally given, along with the previous witness statements. Though Timothy's defense tried to claim that any relationship that had resulted in his DNA being found on Katie's body had been the result of consent, he was found unanimously guilty. One detective would later emphasize, "Tim Hennis is not a dumb man," and the fact that the man's score on an Army General Aptitude test had placed him in the 97th percentile shows that he was indeed clever, almost clever enough to get away with murder. The same detective also recalled Timothy's biting sense of humor, explaining that after being charged with the crime, the man sneered at him. "Looks like I'm going to get to wear one of those little orange jumpsuits." Detective Robert Biddle described his take on Timothy's sinister motivations, saying, "Why do people rob banks? They think that others didn't know how to do it right. That was Tim Hennis's attitude. You can't get me, I'm smarter than you are." From 2010 to 2020, Timothy has attempted multiple appeals and calls for a second trial, all of which have been dismissed. He is once again on death row. The last case
The story of the Eastburn family is a haunting reminder of how easily justice can be derailed. Now, let's turn our attention to a tale that will make your blood run cold. On what should have been the happiest day of her life, Dawn Walker's wedding day turned into a nightmare. Just hours after their ceremony, Dawn was murdered by her new husband, Thomas Nutt. This chilling story is brought to us by @TheGuiltyCrime, and it underscores the dark shadows that can lurk behind seemingly joyous occasions.
For 52-year-old Dawn Walker, October 27, 2021, was meant to be the happiest day of her life. The mother of 3 and grandmother of 3 had found love again with Thomas Nutt, and they were celebrating their wedding at a registry office in Halifax. Friends and family gathered at the Prince Albert pub in Brighouse for the reception, toasting the newlyweds as they began their life together. But Dawn seemed different that day, nervous. Her hands were shaking, and those closest to her noticed she didn't look happy. At 10:30 p.m. that evening, a taxi dropped the couple at their home on Shirley Grove in Lightcliffe. Dawn Walker was captured on CCTV for the last time at 10:36 p.m. She would never be seen alive again.
From the minute she woke up, she was just shaking all the time.
She said, "I think something bad will happen."
And she said, "No, Thomas has killed your mum." So I called my sister and said, Mum's dead.
Dawn Walker was described by those who knew her as having a beautiful soul. She was chirpy and energetic, the kind of person who would give you her last bit of money even if she was struggling herself. Her daughter Cody would later say that Dawn once paid for a disabled man's shopping when he was short of money. That was just who she was. It was a simple gesture, but it perfectly captured Dawn's character. Dawn had 3 daughters, Cody Shaw, Kira Lee Guest, and a 3rd daughter. She was also a devoted grandmother to 3 grandsons who adored her. Family was everything to Dawn, and she was known for her generosity and warmth within her community in Lightcliffe near Halifax. Those who knew Dawn said she never missed a birthday. She would call everyone, acquaintances, best friends, family members, to wish them well. She was the type of person who remembered the little things that mattered to people. Dawn lived in a 3-bedroom bungalow on Shirley Grove in Lightcliffe. The area was home to many young families, and Dawn had integrated well into the community since moving there. She was known locally for selling Avon and Tupperware products, which gave her an excuse to chat with neighbours and build friendships. Within weeks of moving to Shirley Grove, she had held a barbecue to meet her new neighbours. This was typical Dawn, always reaching out, always wanting to connect with people. But behind her bright smile, Dawn was fighting her own battles. She suffered from bipolar disorder and depression, conditions that affected her daily life but never dimmed her generous spirit. These mental health struggles would later be cruelly weaponized against her by the very man who was supposed to protect her. The close-knit community that surrounded Dawn would later rally around her family when tragedy struck. Neighbours had collected £5,000 for her funeral costs, showing just how much she was loved and respected in the area. But in the months leading up to her death, some of those same neighbours had become increasingly concerned about what they were witnessing at 33 Shirley Grove. Dawn met Thomas Nutt in late 2018 or early 2019. What started as a relationship quickly became something much darker.
I think she just wanted somebody to be with her and love her, really. And that's when it started.
Her daughter, Kira Lee would later tell a court that Nutt moved in with her mother very, very quick, and that everything kind of spiraled from there. For Dawn's family, this was the beginning of a nightmare that would last 3 years and end in the most horrific way imaginable. Thomas Nutt was 45 years old when he met Dawn, but his history of violence stretched back decades. He'd first been convicted of grievous bodily harm when he was just 17 years old. In the 1990s, he'd served long prison sentences for robberies. In the early 2000s, he'd spent 16 weeks in jail for deliberately driving into another woman's car in a road rage incident. Between 2005 and 2015, Nutt had been in a relationship with Kimberly Alcock. They met at a travelling fairground in Retford, Nottinghamshire, and moved in together shortly afterwards. Their relationship would produce 3 children and a decade of escalating violence. For the first few years, Kimberly said, Nutt was lovely to her, never violent or aggressive, but that changed after their first child was born. Just 2 days after Kimberly gave birth, the couple had a disagreement about their baby's name. Nutt simply went mad, she later told Bradford Crown Court. He punched her repeatedly in the face, took her phone, and refused to let her leave the house. The violence continued throughout their relationship. In 2009, he attacked her again, but it was the final assault in 2015 that showed just how dangerous Thomas Nutt could be. Kimberly described how he grabbed her by the throat whilst she was in bed, strangling her whilst punching her. He dragged her out of bed and continued the assault, restricting her airways until she thought she was going to die. Kimberly described Nutt as having a deep hatred of women and being a Jekyll and Hyde character. She said he could be very loving and pleasant, but when he lost his temper, he would go mad. When that happened, he would become so focused on his anger that nothing would get through to him and nothing would calm him down. After the 2015 assault, Nutt was convicted and Kimberly was granted a restraining order, but even then, his control continued. Whilst she was living in a safe house, he somehow managed to send 3 smashed Easter eggs with the message, "Did the kids enjoy Easter? I've had restraining order after restraining order just to keep us safe from him," Kimberly would later say. He's a psychopath. When Dawn Walker entered into a relationship with Thomas Nutt, the warning signs were there from the very beginning. Dawn's daughter Kira Lee was just 18 when she was essentially kicked out of the family home because of her arguments with Nutt. She said he didn't like women and respected men more than he respected women, and wouldn't shout at men. The controlling behaviour escalated quickly. Neighbours noticed that Dawn and Nutt were arguing constantly. When Kira Lee returned from Egypt for a holiday in 2020, she found her mother was ill and Nutt was shouting at her, telling Dawn she was a different person because her daughter was there.
And it was like a holiday from hell. He started shouting in my mum's face upstairs. He was following her everywhere. And I got tired of it, so I went upstairs and started arguing with Thomas about how he needed to respect my mum. His facial features just changed, his eyes widened, and he pinned me up against a wall. He's then gripped my head and smashed it against a corner of a wall.
By 2020, the violence had begun. Neighbours saw Dawn with a massive black eye and cuts to her face. Her lips and cheeks were cut and heavily swollen. It was clear to everyone who saw her that she'd been badly beaten. In August 2020, Nutt nearly killed Dawn in an attack so severe that she told others he'd nearly killed her. He was arrested and charged, but Dawn eventually retracted her statements and the charges were dropped. But perhaps the most chilling incident occurred on August 25th, 2021, just 2 months before their wedding. A neighbour, Malcolm Crawshaw, heard noises coming from Dawn's house around 4:30 in the morning. When he went to investigate, he found Dawn in clear distress. Nutt appeared at the top of the stairs and claimed Dawn was having an asthma attack, but Dawn looked directly at her neighbour and said, "Don't believe him, he's trying to kill me." She later told friends that her ribs were killing her, and that "he's broke my ribs." Once again, Nutt was arrested. Once again, Dawn retracted her statements. The cycle of violence, arrest, and retraction was becoming predictable. Each time, the system failed to protect Dawn because she was too afraid to follow through with the charges. And each time, Nutt's confidence grew that he could continue his abuse without consequence. In July 2020, Dawn had reached out to someone who could understand what she was going through. Kimberly Alcock, Nutt's ex-partner. Dawn had discovered that Kimberly had a restraining order against Nutt and wanted to know why. Kimberly told Dawn everything. She showed her photographs of the injuries Nutt had inflicted on her and warned Dawn about his violent temper. Most importantly, she told Dawn, "He will end up killing you one day. Get out." Dawn confided in Kimberly that Nutt scared the hell out of her. The two women stayed in contact over social media, with Dawn occasionally reaching out when things were particularly bad. After the August 2020 attack, Dawn told Kimberly that Nutt had nearly killed her, but then she said she loved him. Kimberly's last message to Dawn was asking if she was going to be okay. Dawn never replied. Nutt had blocked Kimberly from Dawn's social media accounts, cutting off this vital support network. Even Dawn's neighbours could see that something was terribly wrong. In the week before her wedding, Dawn sent a message to her neighbour June asking, "Is it just nerves, June, or just my gut instinct saying, 'Get the hell out and run'?" June replied that it could just be wedding nerves. If only she'd known how right Dawn's instincts were. A week before the wedding, Dawn told her daughter Kira Lee that she had a feeling something bad was going to happen to me. It was as if Dawn knew that her wedding day would also be her last day alive. October 27th, 2021, should have been a celebration. Dawn Walker and Thomas Nutt were married at a registry office in Halifax, surrounded by friends and family who believed they were witnessing the start of a new chapter in Dawn's life. The ceremony was followed by a reception at the Prince Albert pub in Brighouse, where guests toasted the newlyweds and wished them happiness. But those who attended the wedding noticed that something wasn't quite right. Dawn seemed nervous and was visibly shaking throughout the day. She didn't look like a happy bride. Instead, she appeared anxious and distracted, as if she was going through the motions rather than celebrating one of the most important days of her life. Friends and family later described Dawn as looking uncomfortable and unhappy on what should have been her special day. Some put it down to wedding nerves. After all, getting married is a big step for anyone, but others sensed that Dawn's anxiety went deeper than typical pre-wedding jitters. The celebration continued into the evening, with guests unaware of the drama that was about to unfold. Music played, drinks flowed, and people danced, creating memories of what they thought was a joyous occasion. None of them knew they were attending what would essentially become Dawn's wake. At around 10:30 p.m., as the evening was winding down, the newlyweds decided to head home. They called a taxi to take them back to their house on Shirley Grove in Lightcliffe. The journey was short, just a few miles from the pub to their home. The taxi driver later told police that the couple seemed quiet during the journey. There was no conversation, no laughter, none of the excitement you might expect from newlyweds heading home after their wedding celebration. Instead, there was an atmosphere of tension that even a stranger could sense. At 10:36 p.m., the taxi pulled up outside 33 Shirley Grove. CCTV cameras captured the moment Dawn Walker stepped out of the vehicle and walked towards her front door. It would be the last time she was ever seen alive. Within hours, the woman who had just celebrated her wedding would be dead at the hands of the man she had just married. Neighbour Malcolm Crawshaw was in his living room around 11 p.m. when he heard noises coming from next door. The sounds were concerning. Not the usual domestic noise you might expect from a couple returning from their wedding celebration, but something more disturbing. For about an hour, Malcolm heard bumps and thumps coming through the walls, but crucially, he heard no voices. There were no shouts, no screams, no sounds of conversation or argument. This suggested that whatever was happening next door was one-sided, that Dawn had been quickly overpowered and was unable to cry out for help. Sometime between 11 p.m. and midnight on her wedding night, Dawn Walker was murdered by the man she had just married. The woman who had walked down the aisle just hours earlier, who had exchanged vows and rings, who had been toasted by friends and family, was now lying dead in her own bedroom. What Thomas Nutt did to Dawn Walker on their wedding night was an act of unimaginable brutality. The post-mortem examination would later reveal that Dawn had suffered extensive injuries in a violent assault. The forensic evidence showed that Dawn had been beaten and then strangled with considerable force. The pathologist determined that the attack had been deliberate and sustained. Evidence also showed that Dawn had tried to defend herself, but at 52 years old and much smaller than Nutt, she was no match for his size and strength. The attack appeared to have taken place in the bedroom, which meant that Dawn was cornered with no escape route. She would have been trapped, unable to flee or call for help. What made the murder even more chilling was that it took place just hours after Dawn and Nut had exchanged wedding vows. The man who had promised to love and cherish her had instead killed her in their bedroom. After murdering his wife, Nut faced a practical problem: what to do with her body. His solution revealed the cold, calculating nature of his character. Rather than calling for help or showing any remorse for what he had done, he immediately began planning how to cover up his crime. What Thomas Nutt did after murdering his wife was almost as shocking as the murder itself. He embarked on what prosecutors would later call a ghastly charade designed to cover up his crime and deflect suspicion. First, he hid Dawn's body in a kitchen cupboard. At 1 a.m. on October 28th, just hours after murdering Dawn, he sent text messages from her mobile phone to her daughter. The messages were clearly not from Dawn. They were not in the language or style of her mother. Nutt spent the early hours washing clothes that he had worn on the night Dawn died. CCTV later captured him at 5:10 p.m. hanging washing in the back garden, clothes that had been washed just hours after his wife's murder. Then, in a grotesque mockery of a honeymoon, Nutt travelled alone to Skegness with their caravan. He told neighbours and friends that Dawn had wanted to go on their honeymoon as planned. All the while, Dawn's body remained hidden in the kitchen cupboard at their home. On October 31st, Halloween, Nutt returned and spent the morning putting up Halloween decorations around the house, including police tape. Dawn's corpse was still hidden inside. When Dawn failed to appear for a planned meeting with her daughter at a Wilko store, Nutt made a 999 call at lunchtime reporting her missing. He told police that Dawn had mental health problems and painted himself as the worried husband who had no idea where his wife could be. The performance that Thomas Nutt put on after reporting Dawn missing was particularly cruel. He took Dawn's daughter Kira Lee and her young son out to search for Dawn, knowing all along that she was dead and hidden in their house. Kira Lee would later describe the horror of this experience.
So now that I know what happened when I was in Mum's house feeding my son, she was in the cupboard. And we wasn't even 2 meters apart.
They visited local shops, hospitals, and searched the neighbourhood, with Nutt playing the part of the concerned stepfather. The cruelest part came when they returned to the house. He then took me back to the house, and I prepared my son's lunch in the same spot my mum had been killed so violently, Kira Lee told the court. Meanwhile, pressure was mounting on Nutt to allow police to search the house. Realising that he couldn't delay much longer without appearing suspicious, Nutt knew he had to remove Dawn's body from the property. At 4:38 p.m. on October 31st, CCTV cameras showed Nutt dragging a large suitcase through his back garden. The timing was significant. It was just minutes before police officers were due to arrive at the house to conduct a search. Suspicious neighbours had noticed Nutt's unusual behaviour with the suitcase. One neighbour was so concerned that they called the police with an anonymous tip-off reporting seeing Nutt with the suitcase. At around 3 p.m. on October 31st, members of the public discovered Dawn's body in undergrowth near Aysgarth Avenue, not far from Shirley Grove. She had been dumped in the bushes and left there. That evening, Thomas Nutt handed himself in to police. Though even then he couldn't tell the truth about what he had done. He claimed that he had killed Dawn on October 30th, not on their wedding night, in an attempt to minimise his culpability. The investigation into Dawn Walker's murder was led by Detective Inspector Amanda Wimbles of West Yorkshire Police. She described Nutt as a seasoned, practised liar who had constructed an elaborate web of deceit to cover up his crime. The evidence against Nutt was overwhelming. CCTV footage showed him dragging the suitcase containing Dawn's body at precisely the time when police were about to search his house. There was no CCTV evidence of Dawn leaving the house after 10:36 p.m. on their wedding night. The false text messages sent from Dawn's phone provided clear evidence of his deception. Most damning of all was the testimony of those who knew Nutt's history of violence. Kimberly Alcock bravely gave evidence about the years of abuse she had suffered at his hands. When the trial began at Bradford Crown Court in July 2022, Nutt admitted to manslaughter but denied murder. His defense team argued that he had lost his temper after Dawn told him she wanted a divorce just hours after their wedding, claiming the killing was spontaneous rather than premeditated. But prosecutor Alistair MacDonald described Nutt as a master of deceit with a tendency to attack his female partners. The prosecution argued that this was the culmination of years of escalating domestic violence. Nutt chose not to give evidence in his own defense. The prosecution argued that he had no answers for the overwhelming evidence against him. The trial lasted 11 days and heard evidence from dozens of witnesses. On August 10, 2022, after just a few hours of deliberation, the jury returned a unanimous guilty verdict for murder. There were cheers and shouts from the public gallery as justice was finally delivered for Dawn Walker. 9 days later, Thomas Nutt was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 21 years.
To be honest, I'd have liked him to get a lot longer, but they said that that was the highest sentence they could give because he'd handed himself in as well, and they have to take that into account.
The murder of Dawn Walker highlighted tragic failures in the system designed to protect victims of domestic violence. Despite multiple incidents of violence and clear warnings, Dawn was not adequately protected. In August 2020, Nutt was arrested for assaulting Dawn so severely that she told others he'd nearly killed her, but charges were dropped when Dawn retracted her statements. The pattern repeated itself in August 2021, just 2 months before their wedding. Each time charges were dropped, Nutt's confidence grew. He learned that he could assault Dawn without serious consequences. The system failed to connect the dots between Nutt's past behaviour and the ongoing danger he posed to Dawn. After the trial, prosecutors noted that this was a predictable and preventable murder. The warning signs were all there, but the system failed to act decisively enough to save Dawn's life. Kimberly Alcock said, "The way he behaved with Dawn was the same as with me, but one woman survived and one didn't. I was lucky. In 2022, it was reported that Thomas Nutt had been attacked while serving his sentence at HMP Leeds. In October 2022, Nutt lodged an appeal against his conviction. Thomas Nutt took everything from Dawn Walker: her life, her dreams, her future with her daughters and grandchildren.
There's no words for him. There isn't. I hate him.
You know, I lost my best friend, I lost my mum. I lost my son's nana. My nana, she basically cries every day. You know, my sister struggles to sleep. We're still a close family, but there's always a piece that's going to be missing.
But he couldn't take away the memory of the beautiful, generous, loving woman she was. Please don't forget Dawn Walker. Remember her not for how she died, but for how she lived, with kindness, generosity, and love for everyone around her. Her light may have been extinguished too soon, but her memory will endure in the hearts of all those who knew and loved her. If you or someone you know is experiencing domestic violence, please reach out for help. Call the National Domestic Violence Helpline or contact your local police. Dawn Walker's death was preventable. Let's make sure her story helps prevent others from suffering the same fate.
A wedding day turned into a tragedy, truly a nightmare scenario? As we process that shocking story, we move on to another tale of domestic despair. Bree and Colin Turner's story, shared by @The Decoder Production, is a devastating account of how a domestic dispute escalated into murder. In a heated argument, Bree was convicted of killing her husband, Colin. This case reveals the thin line between love and violence that can sometimes be crossed.
An ordinary afternoon in Gulf Breeze, Florida. On this quiet suburban street, a married couple are arguing, as couples often do. But for these two, today, it's different.
Remember what I said to you?
What was that?
You just shot me!
She just shot him. I just heard 4 shots.
The local police department received 3 911 calls from the Turner's house on September 8th, 2021. This was the last call. When somebody calls the emergency services, it's clear they're in trouble, but rarely does the call capture a crime being committed. Here, the sound of gunshots were exactly what they seemed to be. the sound of 34-year-old Colin James Turner being murdered. When the police got to the scene, they found Colin's wife, 34-year-old Bree Kuhn. She was the only adult in the house, and it was clear she'd had something to do with it. But why? What had led her to the point of mercilessly executing her husband while he was on the phone to the police? A troubled relationship, kids caught in the middle, and a he-said-she-said situation that ended in murder. It should have been a fairy tale marriage. But here, on the decoder, things don't often work out that way. This is the tragic story of Bree Kuhn and Colin Turner. Gulf Breeze is a quiet, picturesque place in the Pensacola area of Florida. It's coastal, an ideal destination for vacation or retirement, and known for its excellent schools, beaches, and good education. What more could a family ask for? But some families bring their strife with them. It was an ordinary Wednesday afternoon, towards the end of the summer season, when a police patrol car was called to a quiet suburban street. This was not the first call they'd received from this residence that afternoon, but this one was fatal.
Anybody else in there? Can we open this?
The police had to climb underneath the door to enter Colin Turner's garage, which had now become a crime scene. Inside, they found Colin lying dead on the floor, covered in blood.
I don't know who he is, but he's in the garage. 3 in the chest, or looks like 3 in the chest. Might be 2. They said they heard 4 gunshots, though.
On the 911 call, 4 shots had rung out, and then Colin had fallen silent.
Sir, are you there? He's not answering.
This was why the police had hastened to the scene, because the 911 operator believed she'd listened to a murder in real time. And with Colin dead on the floor of his own garage, it seemed she'd been right. The police spread out and searched the property. In particular, they were searching for the murder weapon. They found a gun in the kitchen.
It looks like it's in the holster.
Yeah.
But it's stuck behind the toaster.
Stuck behind a toaster.
This was an act of violence committed at the heart of the domestic space. The gun was hidden in the kitchen, the victim was locked in the garage, and the kids were just across the street. They'd been in the house when their father was murdered. When the police got to the scene, those 3 kids were present. 2 were Colin and Bree's children, aged 4 and 3, while the third was Bree's 12-year-old daughter from a previous relationship. The cops found Bree sitting with the daughter on a neighbor's porch, talking to her about what had happened.
She told her that everything would be fine and that she was sorry. And when I spoke to her, I asked her if she was all right. And she said that I shot him.
Within minutes of the shooting, with her daughter right there, Bree confessed. She said she'd been the one to shoot her husband.
She told me that she shot him because he was going to take that she shot him because he was going to take my children.
Bree seemed to be in a state of shock.
Are you in shock?
Well, do me a favor. Can you,
Is he alive?
they're working on him right now.
Okay.
She didn't seem to realize that she'd killed Colin, not at first, but the horrific reality sank in as the police were patting her down.
He was dead. I saw him and I tried to help, but he was dead. Okay, well, let's not talk about that right now, okay? My kids don't have a dad or a mom now. And it's my fault. And he's right. I'm a murderer.
Listen to me. You're not under arrest right now. You're being detained, okay? While we investigate.
No, you should arrest me. I killed my husband.
Bree's mood was going up and down. From being convinced Colin was dead, she then suggested that maybe
A tragic escalation in what should have been a safe sanctuary. Our next story highlights a chilling breach of trust. Sarah Everard's case, covered by at Into the Deep Crime, involves her abduction and murder by a serving police officer. This horrifying crime has sparked urgent calls for systemic reform in law enforcement and women's safety. It is a stark reminder of the dangers many women face daily.
Just from what I've got on the room.
Have you met a person now?
No, not personally.
Have you had any interactions with it?
What would I person? interactions with her. Sat in handcuffs and well, I know her, so you must have something to say that I know her.
Now, we believe that you know something about where she is, and that's why we're here, to look for her and to try and find her. And that's why we're talking to you now, is to try and get you to have a good think about it. Just anything you can about it.
Okay, well, I am in financial, and I've been lent on by, I don't know who they are, they're a group, a gang, whatever, and they told me, well, I need to go and pick up girls and give them to them. So I said, happening, and it then came through that they're going to harm my family, take them away, you know, use them instead. At that point I had no option to try and find somebody.
Tell me about them. I need to find them. Tell me everything you know.
Okay,
that you'll help me.
There was a white Sprinter van. Bar, it was between sort of Lemon and Stone area that I dropped her off. I still don't know. I don't know. They just, I just parked my car up, and then the van come up behind me, flashed me, and they all jumped out, and then they took this girl. So I just got out, opened my door, opened that door, pushed me out against the front of the car, took the girl, drove off. That's it. They said we'll be in touch. So I'm here. I'm off work with stress because I'm here to protect my family. I want to be here 24/7 for my family. They come from my family. I've got nothing myself.
Wayne Couzens was subsequently charged with Sarah's murder, a crime that shook the nation to its core. The revelation that a police officer, someone entrusted with upholding the law, could be implicated in such a heinous crime sent shockwaves through the public and raised serious questions about the integrity of the police force. The investigation uncovered shocking details about Couzens' actions, painting a chilling picture of his behavior leading up to the arrest. Despite Couzens' attempts to evade justice, the investigation continued relentlessly, uncovering more evidence and piecing together the events that led to Sarah's tragic fate. The case highlighted the dedication and perseverance of law enforcement agencies in the face of adversity, as they worked tirelessly to bring justice to Sarah and her family. As the investigation unfolded, new developments continued to emerge, keeping the public on edge and raising more questions than answers. The search for justice for Sarah Everard was far from over, with each new revelation adding a layer of complexity to an already intricate case. The nation waited with bated breath as the authorities worked tirelessly to uncover the truth and bring those responsible to justice. The arrest of Wayne Couzens, a serving Metropolitan Police officer, sent shockwaves through the community and raised serious questions about the integrity of the police force. Couzens' arrest was a pivotal moment in the investigation into Sarah Everard's disappearance, as it revealed a disturbing twist in the case. On the day of his arrest, Couzens was taken into custody by detectives investigating Sarah's disappearance. The news that a police officer was being held on suspicion of kidnapping and murdering Sarah sent shockwaves through the community and cast a shadow over the entire investigation. People were horrified to learn that someone sworn to protect them could be implicated in such a heinous crime. As details of Couzens' arrest emerged, it became clear that the investigation had taken a chilling turn. Couzens, a married father of two, was a serving police officer with the Diplomatic Protection Unit, tasked with guarding diplomatic premises in London, including Downing Street and foreign embassies. His arrest stunned colleagues and friends, who described him as a normal and quiet individual, raising concerns about how well we really know those around us. Following his arrest, Couzens was taken into custody for questioning, and forensic teams conducted searches at his home and other locations linked to him. The scale of the investigation widened, with authorities leaving no stone unturned in their quest for answers. In a shocking development, Cousins pleaded guilty to kidnapping, raping, and murdering Sarah Everard.
Worth saying, of course, I fully understand the strength of feeling, I think, as a woman, and hearing from people about their experiences in the past and what they feel about what happened to Sarah and what has been going on. I understand why so many people wanted to come and pay their respects and kind of make a statement about this. Indeed, if it had been lawful, I'd have been there. I'd have been at a vigil. 6 hours of yesterday was really calm and peaceful. Very few police officers around, respectful, people laying flowers, not gathering, and a vigil that did not breach the regulations. Unfortunately, later on, we had a really big crowd that gathered, lots of speeches, and quite rightly, as far as I can see, my team felt this is now an unlawful gathering, which poses a considerable risk to people's health, according to the regulations. A really invidious position for my officers to find themselves in, but they then moved to try to explain to people, to engage with people, to get people to disperse from this unlawful gathering, and many, many, many people did. Unfortunately, a small minority.
His guilty plea sent shockwaves through the courtroom, as well as the nation, as the full extent of his crimes was laid bare. The court heard how Cousins abducted Sarah as she walked home from a friend's house in South London, using his police-issued vehicle to commit the crime. The impact of Cousins' guilty plea reverberated far beyond the courtroom, sending a wave of grief and anger through the public. Sarah's family was devastated by the news, struggling to come to terms with the loss of their beloved daughter and sister. The guilty plea brought some closure to the family, knowing that Cousins had admitted to his crimes, but it also reopened old wounds, forcing them to relive the pain of Sarah's death. The public reaction to Cousins' guilty plea was one of outrage and disbelief. Many questioned how someone entrusted with upholding the law could commit such a horrific crime. The case reignited a national debate about women's safety and the need for systemic change to prevent similar tragedies in the future. The sentencing hearing for Wayne Cousins commenced on the 29th of September 2021 at the Old Bailey, presided over by Lord Justice Fulford. Following medical and psychiatric reports, Cousins' barrister Jim Sturman QC requested a life sentence with a determinate tariff, suggesting that Cousins could become eligible for release on license in his 80s. However, on the 30th of September 2021, Lord Justice Fulford sentenced Cousins to life imprisonment with a whole life order.
We are today handing down our written judgment in cases concerning the sentences of 4 offenders convicted of murder and 1 of manslaughter. The second concerns Wayne Cousins, who pleaded guilty to kidnap and rape of Sarah Everard, and later he pleaded guilty to her murder. On the 30th of September 2021, he was sentenced to imprisonment for life for the murder with a whole life order. No separate penalty was imposed for the offences of kidnapping and rape. Cousins seeks leave to appeal against sentence. In his case, we grant leave to appeal against sentence but dismiss the appeal. Although the circumstances of his case do not fall within the terms of the statutory provision, which provides that a whole life order should be the normal starting point, the individual facts are such that the judge was entitled, exceptionally, to impose a whole life order. That concludes this short hearing.
All right.
Fulford emphasized that Cousins' abuse of his position as a police officer to detain Sarah Everard was a crucial factor that significantly elevated the severity of the case. Despite the sentencing, Cousins sought leave to appeal against his sentence, a request that was reported in October 2021. However, in July 2022, the Court of Appeal rejected Cousins' appeal against his whole life sentence, affirming the severity of his punishment. As of December 2021, Wayne Couzens was serving his sentence at HM Prison Franklin in County Durham. His time in prison was further marred by additional charges. In March 2022, Couzens faced 4 counts of indecent exposure related to alleged incidents in January and February 2021. Subsequently, in February 2023, Couzens pleaded guilty to 3 incidents of indecent exposure that occurred in Kent in 2020 and 2021, with 3 additional counts ordered to lie on file. In a disturbing revelation, in November 2022, 2 of Couzens' colleagues, PC Jonathan Cobbin and former PC Joel Borders, were imprisoned for multiple counts of sending grossly offensive messages on a public communications network. The 2 officers were part of a WhatsApp group chat with Couzens and another officer, where they exchanged racist, homophobic, misogynistic, and ableist messages. In April 2023, it was reported that despite his heinous crimes, Couzens could be entitled to a police pension worth £7,000 a year. This revelation drew criticism, especially considering that Mayor of London Sadiq Khan had successfully applied to have Couzens stripped of his Metropolitan Police pension. However, it was noted that Couzens may be entitled to pensions from his pre-Met service, highlighting a glaring gap in the system. The tragic case of Sarah Everard's abduction, rape, and murder shocked the world and raised serious questions about women's safety and police accountability. Wayne Couzens, a serving police officer, abused his position of trust, leading to devastating consequences. The investigation, arrest, and sentencing of Couzens revealed glaring gaps in the system that must be addressed. Despite being convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment, Couzens' case highlights the need for stricter vetting processes and more rigorous monitoring of police officers' behavior. The fact that Couzens was able to commit such heinous crimes while serving as a police officer raises concerns about the effectiveness of background checks and mental health assessments in law enforcement recruitment. Furthermore, the revelation that Couzens could be entitled to a police pension despite his crimes raises ethical questions about the treatment of convicted officers. Should individuals convicted of such serious crimes retain any benefits from their former profession? This issue calls for a re-evaluation of the policies surrounding pension entitlements for convicted officers. Sarah Everard's case serves as a somber reminder of the need for societal change and systemic reforms to ensure the safety and protection of women. It is a call to action for authorities to prioritize the safety of all citizens and to hold accountable those who abuse their power. As we reflect on this tragic event, we must work towards a future where such atrocities are prevented and justice is served for victims and their families. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to like the video, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss out on any future uploads. See you in the next video.
Sarah Everard's case is a sobering example of broken systems in dire need of repair. Finally, we explored the tragic case of Tyler Edmonds, a 13-year-old boy wrongfully accused of murdering his half-sister's husband. This story, detailed by an unreal true crime, reveals a complex web of manipulation, betrayal, and judicial failure. Tyler's plight is a chilling example of how young lives can be irreversibly altered by the justice system's mistakes.
In the spring of 2003, Tyler Edmonds, a boy of only 13 years old, confessed to something that left everyone in shock. He and his half-sister, Christy Fulgham, had killed her husband. What seemed to be a senseless tragedy in an apparently normal home revealed a story of manipulation and betrayal that nobody imagined. But thanks to the courage of Tyler's mother and the tireless efforts of his attorney, the truth came to light, and what appeared to be a tragic accident became one of the most shocking and complex cases in history. This is the case of Tyler Edmonds. Are you ready for the darkest stories Britain has to offer? Introducing our new book, Unreal True Crime, British edition. 35 shocking true murder cases that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Available now on Amazon in paperback and Kindle, or grab your instant PDF download from our website. Links are in the description below. Don't miss out. Get your copy today. And now, let's continue with today's case. Tyler Edmonds was born on June 14, 1989, in the American state of Mississippi. He was the son of the marriage formed by Sharon Clay and Danny Edmonds. At that time, Danny was already the father of a teenage daughter named Christy, born from a previous relationship. In 1993, when Tyler was about 4 years old, his mother and father divorced, and for various reasons, he was not allowed to maintain contact with his father. As time passed, the boy's desire to see Danny again grew stronger and stronger. It was during this time that Christy became his only refuge. When Tyler was around 12 years old, Christy began organizing weekend meetings so that both could spend time together without the boy's mother knowing. This complicity made Tyler's attachment to his half-sister even stronger. For him, she was the most important person in the world. At that time, Christy was married to Joey Fulgham. The marriage had 3 beautiful children, and in their community, Joey was known for his firm commitment to his family. But despite her husband showering her with love, Christy was not happy. In fact, she began having affairs without discretion. The situation became so serious that the couple appeared on a well-known talk show. During that episode, Christy made a shocking revelation. She openly admitted that her youngest child was not her husband's. Despite this, as she herself acknowledged on the program, Joey decided to continue being that child's father. However, Joey's efforts seemed in vain when around 2002, his wife took the children and moved in with her lover at the time, Kyle Harvey. Yet by May 2003, Christy had returned to live with Joey, and both were trying to save their marriage. Or at least, that's what he believed. Meanwhile, at 13 years old, Tyler was an outstanding student at his middle school. He had no history of violence. He didn't belong to any gang, nor did he show problematic behaviors. On the contrary, he frequently attended his church and respected adults. To those who knew him, he was a kind and affectionate boy, always willing to help and please others. That same kindness, however, would end up becoming his greatest vulnerability. Friday, May 9th of that year, Tyler was excited. His half-sister had promised him that he would spend the weekend at the beach.
The case of Tyler Edmonds leaves us questioning how such a young life could be caught in such a tangled web. It's stories like these that remind us of the fragility of justice. Thank you for joining us on this journey through some of the most gripping true crime stories. If you haven't already, please like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss any future content. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time on True Real Studios.